In this video, we're going to look at the Dread rig pack for the 11 rack. Okay, so let's jump right in. Now, when you first download the Dread rig pack, you'll be downloading this zip file. Simply unzip it and you'll get all of this. 399 rigs. It's actually 798 if you're counting the mono version of each rig, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Also included are some effect presets. So let me quickly explain how to decipher the names of each preset or rig. So first we have Dread, that's of course the rig pack name, and then we'll have the amp used. So in this case it's the M2, and then we'll have the cabinet, in this case the B30, and then we'll have the microphone used. 57, that's pretty easy to figure out. And then there'll be a letter, either A, B, C, X, Y, or Z. And this can get kind of confusing, but basically A, B, or C will be on axis, X, Y, or Z will be off axis, plus the A, B, or C, so you can see here, also corresponds to a parametric EQ setting. But there's also an equal sign, you see, separating the amp, the cab, the microphone. That lets us know this is a stereo output rig. If you look over here, you'll see after the FX loop, it almost looks like equal signs between each of these effects. And as we know, that just means there's two signals coming out here to the effects, so we can get, a stereo signal like we have here. Right? Now also included are mono rigs. Yes, you could easily switch this yourself by either coming up here in the standalone 11 rack editor, come right up here to the volume tab, and if you click this, you'll see it changes to mono. And now it looks like a dash between each of these effects, and we know that means there's one signal running straight through. So now we have this same rig that we just heard a little bit of earlier. Now it's a mono rig, and this is going through a mono track. You'll see there's not as much width in the sound of that track because we don't have two signals running through our stereo effects, our multi-chorus, flanger, reverb. So as I mentioned, mono rigs are included along with the regular or stereo rigs. Now, as I mentioned, you could easily switch this yourself, either by just clicking the speaker icon here in the 11 rack editor, or by switching it yourself from the 11 rack. Simply press the edit back button, scroll down to the end here where it says output, and then you can simply select mono or stereo. Now I definitely suggest you start with the stereo rig packs so you can hear how they sound, but you may want to use a mono rig pack when recording mono tracks. Maybe in your double tracking, you'll want to use, two mono tracks, left and right. You may want to use the mono rigs, but you could also, of course, use the stereo rigs and just choose, 11 left and then 11 right for each mono track. And also you would be doing two passes. You couldn't record it at the same time. It needs to be two different performances to have, an actual double track. So just real quickly, I'll show you here. I'll go to load all rigs from computer, and we'll navigate to the 102 Dread rigs. And you can see up top here, these are the regular or stereo rigs. And then right here are the mono rigs. Now these are set to exactly the same settings. The only difference is, they're mono. So we'll choose this. I just double click there and that's going to load them up. And now the mono version of the rigs are loaded, and we'll click on it here. You can see they're named the same way. The only thing that's different is there's a dash instead of an equal sign. So that lets us know right off the bat that it's a mono signal all the way through. So there's 102 different M2 rigs, 102 stereo, then 102 mono. So we'll just grab another one. All right, so hopefully you understand the difference between the mono and the stereo. So now let's load up another rig pack here. We'll load up some of the dual rectifier. And the dual rectifier presets are available in the modern and in the vintage version of that amp. So we'll just grab the moderns here, load these up. All right, the dual rectifier rigs have been loaded. You can see they're named in exactly the same way. They have the same effects chain. There'll always be a green distortion, a parametric EQ, multi-chorus, flanger. There'll be a delay setting that will be off by default, of course, and then a little bit of reverb just for some room noise. And again, they're named the same way. In this case, DR means dual rectifier. B30 again is the 2x12 B30. And then 57A, that's on axis. And A is for the number 1 setting for the Dread Parametric EQ. In this case, that would be right here. Now, if I switch over to the B setting, you'll see the parametric EQ change, but we're using the same microphone and it's also on axis. So now the parametric EQ changed, and B corresponds to the number 2 setting of the dual rectifier parametric EQ. And you'll notice here that there's actually several number 2 settings. In this case, there's version 1, version 2, 3, and 4. These are just slightly different variations. So if I choose version 4, that's actually the one that's being used here. If I go to number 1, you'll see there's some changes there. And all of these effect presets are also included with the Dread presets. So you can switch them around, mix and match on your own. So hopefully that makes sense. Now we'll go to the 57X. Now the X will be the same EQ setting as the A setting. All right, so now if I switch to A, you'll see the parametric EQ is actually the same. The difference is on X, we have off axis. And if we go to the Z setting, there's no Y in this case. If we go to Z, Z is off axis, but it's the same parametric EQ setting as B, because there's 2 different parametric EQs for the dual rectifier. For some of the other presets, like the Ecstasy and SLO, there's 1 parametric EQ setting. For the SOD, there's 1 parametric EQ setting. For the M2 or the Mark II C+, there's actually 3 settings. So you'll have A, B, and C, X, Y, and Z. Whereas for like the Ecstasy, you'll have A, Z, you know. So we'll look at that real quick here. We'll just pop in here. Again, we have the mono rigs or the stereo here. So BX in this case stands for Bogner Ecstasy, 65 watt, 7A, and then we go right to the 7Z, and then there's 21A, 21Z, and they'll have the same parametric EQ setting here. So we'll look at number 1. Right here is the Ecstasy parametric EQ. We can see for the M2, there's 3 settings, and there's actually several versions of setting number 3. You can just cycle through those as you wish. For the SOD, there's 1 setting, but there's a couple versions of that setting. And now to explain this next concept, I'm going to load up those SOD rigs. So we'll navigate to our folder, load up the 47 Dread rigs. All right, so we have the SOD rigs loaded up now. These are called SD. That lets us know it's the SOD. And real quick here, let me just explain the names. So the Ecstasy, the Bogner Ecstasy, that's BX. The SLO 100, that's simply SL for the amp. For the SOD, as we mentioned, it's SD. For the Mesa Mark II C+, it's M2. For the dual rectifier, it's DR for, dual rectifier. For the vintage dual rectifier, it's VR, and that's it. And all of this is included in the ReadME here. But now we're going to look at the concept of this parametric EQ and using the low filter to actually adjust the bass. Now, as you can see here, I have a high pass 12 on this EQ setting, and that's the same for every rig. Now, usually when you have a high pass, but whether it's a 6, a 12, or a 24, you're probably used to getting a sound like, really kind of pulling that bass out of there. And if you'll look over here on our frequency analyzer, when I play that, all right, so that acts, as you expect a high pass filter to act. But with the 11 rack, if you raise the Q from around 0.7, you actually end up getting sort of a resonant peak right around your frequency midpoint. All right, so let me raise it up to about where it was. Actually, you know what? I'll just load up the setting again. There we go. So it's around 4.9. So now when I play, again, it's still a high pass 12. I just raised the Q. If you look at our frequency analyzer. All right, so if you notice that, I'll just strum here. You see we still have the nice drop off. Then we have a resonant peak there in the low end So by using this low filter and using the high pass 12 with a higher Q, I'm actually able to adjust the bass instead of just relying on simply a bass knob. Now you could adjust the bass with the bass knob. First, let me switch to a rig that picks up bass frequencies a little better. Something like the 67, the condenser 67 mic. All right, so if I play now, right? So now if I were to lower the Q filter here and now play, slightly less bass, pull down a little more. Now it's acting more like you expect a high pass to act. And then I can actually go crazy and go way up. So if you notice over here on our frequency analyzer while I was playing, we still had a drop off in the lower area, but then we had a huge peak right around where my frequency is centered. So as I mentioned, you can adjust bass in a different way from simply using the bass knob. And sometimes you may want to use the bass knob. Other times you may want to use, a combination of maybe both of them, because the bass knob on each amp is going to sound slightly different in the way it introduces or takes away frequencies. So you can just mess around with that if you find there's too much bass in these presets. So let me turn it down a bit. So now if I were to play, it's right around 5. Now I could maybe come over here and pull out the bass on the amp. Now that definitely pulls out some bass, but maybe I like the sound of the bass that comes from the amp, and then I want to control it a little more with my high pass filter. So there you go. I hope that makes sense on how I'm using the low filter, the high pass 12, to adjust the bass for these rigs. Now these rigs are meant to be, kind of more modern rigs. They have a lot of grind to them and a lot of bass to them. If you find there's too much bass, you can of course adjust, as I just showed, using the Q control on the high pass 12, or you can adjust from your bass knob. If you find there's too much treble, you can reduce the gain here on our high filter, or you can of course use presence and treble. But if you're recording, you may want to use filter in your DAW. So we'll take a look at this real quick. So if I play, turn on the high pass and the low pass, and you can see how that works. I can pull that out a little more, turn that to a 12. And now if I play, so there you go. You could do that as well. If you don't want to make the adjustments, on the 11 rack, you can make them later on in your DAW where you have a little more control of the exact sound. But of course, if you're playing live, you'll have to make some adjustments on the 11 rack itself, or if you're plugged into a board, you can do it at the control board. And let me touch on that bass resonance just one more time here. So as we explained, if I have a higher Q, something higher than around 0.7, I start to get a peak around the center frequency when I'm using a high pass filter. And to sort of graphically show that, it's sort of like this here. So you'll notice I have a high pass filter here in the EQ3 7-band plugin that everybody will have. So the high pass is set to 12 dB per octave, which is the same setting we have here. And you notice as I adjust this frequency, right here, you'll see how the high pass works. And that's, usually how you expect a high pass to work. If I switch it up to 18 dB per octave, 24 dB, you can see how the sound drops off. Now there's no Q control on this high pass filter, so I can't show you exactly how it happens with the 11 rack when we start raising the Q, because there's no Q control here. But if you look at the frequency analyzer, we can pretty much tell what's going on. So if I have this on a, say, a 12 dB per octave, just like on our 11 rack, we'll adjust it to around 70 or so, which is where most of these will be centered. And by the way, you can actually change the centered frequency and emphasize a lower or higher range. That's actually the other setting here of the SOD version 2. You'll see we have a lower frequency range emphasized here, but you can experiment with that yourself. So back over here. So we have our high pass filter, 12 dB, it's dropping off as we'd expect. But then on the 11 rack, when we start to raise the Q, we're not dropping off as much bass as we would see here graphically. So what kind of happens when you start to raise the Q on the 11 rack is, I'll just see if I can show this. I'll send this around the same frequency. And what it sounds like and looks like to me, what's happening, based on the frequency analyzer, is you'll notice that as it drops off, there's actually a raise around the center frequency. Be kind of like that is what would happen graphically. And then another way to show that would be to, let me turn these off. Now this is on a shelf. So let's look at what happens to this sort of filter. So if I pull down the gain, go down to around 70 or so, you see my Q here is around 1. So about 0.7, that's kind of how a high pass 12 drops off. It'll of course keep dropping straight down on a normal high pass filter. But notice what happens when I start to raise the Q here. You see how we kind of get that resonant peak there right around our center frequency? That sounds to me and looks like to me what is happening on our 11 rack when we start to raise that Q higher than around 0.7. See that? We start getting that peak. So anyway, that's sort of a graphical representation of how I'm using a high pass 12 filter to actually get more bass, more resonant bass, chest pounding bass than you would expect with a high pass filter. So now let's look at the effect presets that are included. So there will be a green distortion for each rig, and they are included in the download as well. You'll see they're named Dread, G setting for green, then OD for overdrive, and then the amp that they're for. In the M2's case, you have two different versions that you could use. So here's the MDR, Mesidor Rec, Ecstasy, SLO, SOD. That's all easy to understand. So these will be included. You can dial those up, mix and match however you want. As mentioned, there's a bunch of parametric EQ settings included. There are multi-chorus settings included, which we can see here. We'll go to the effect presets. Right here, multi-chorus. There's 3 different settings. The low cut on this is raised to around 70 to sort of tighten things up, so we don't have a huge resonating sound. But, if you want a huge resonating sound, you can just simply pull that down. All right, but to tighten it up a bit, I have it around the 70 mark. And you'll notice the names here, 75.3, 75.6, 100.6. That refers to the width is on 75. The voices is 3. On this here, say 75.6, that would mean the voices are on 6, so that's a bit of a wider sound. And 100.6, that would mean the width is on 100 with 6 voices. And again, these presets are included. So I've explained before why I use a chorus. It just adds that width, that depth, that sort of surrounding sound, almost more of an amp in the room sound. And also there's a flanger, which I've explained in, I think, the Fury rig pack. I use this to sort of make the cabinet sound more oversized, and it makes the final tone more encompassing, more amp in the room versus recorded amp sound with a mic, at least, to my ears. Now, there are no flanger presets included, but every rig uses the number 4 preset from the Fury pack. So you can just download the Fury pack if you want to switch through these. Then, as mentioned, there'll be a delay setting and a reverb setting, but none of those are included with the download. As you can see, you get your overdrive, multi-chorus, and your parametric EQ settings. And you can either take these settings and simply drag and drop them into the correct folder for your 11 rack editor. You'd simply just grab them all and then drop them into the correct folder. These are EQs, so I drop them into the EQ folder. Or, which might be a better idea, is just go to each different effect item. Basically just go to effect presets, go to import, and then select those settings and import them that way. If you need that explained further, watch the standalone 11 rack editor video to see that in action. All right, so I think that explains everything about the Dread rigs. In total, there are 798 rigs if you include the mono version of each rig pack. And all of the Dread rigs are provided absolutely for free. Just look in the description for the download link and download them. Open your 11 rack editor and do load all from computer. That's the easiest way to get each pack loaded onto your 11 rack quickly. The Dread rig pack for the 11 rack with effect preset settings. So go ahead and go download it now.